Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show. My guest today is the incredible man, Paul Ingles. He's a radio producer, a reporter, an audio engineer, oral historian, consultant, actor, and filmmaker. This guy has an amazing story. He's been working in radio since 1975 and has produced some amazing music documentary series for public radio on the Beatles, on Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, Tom Petty, James Brown, Glenn Frey, David Bowie. The list goes on and on. He's also worked quite a bit with NPR. I mean, literally, if you go to the NPR page and type in his name, about 524 results come up. He's got really just an incredible body of work. We even talk a little bit about in this interview about an article that he did called Homegrown Unexplored Music Scenes, Albuquerque, a scene blooms in the desert. And it wasn't too many years before that, in 2008, I believe it was about 2004 or 5 or 6, that he produced a series called Jazz of Enchantment. And that series really had an impact on my life. I heard it and, of course, listened to my guitar teacher, Michael Anthony, talk about his years as a studio musician. I also got to hear the story of so many amazing, amazing musicians that reside in Albuquerque, New Mexico, as well as I got to hear the story about some young up-and-coming musicians who were making some noise, and it inspired me to want to be one of those musicians myself. He also put on a series that he started at KUNM with his wife at the time called Peace Talks Radio. And of course, we get a little more into that in the podcast. Mr. Paul Ingles is such a generous guy with his time, with his kind nature, as well as sharing the work that he's up to. He's currently working on a film, as well as just recently finished an amazing film called A Soldier's Passage. Now, it's pretty interesting getting to talk to him about his work, as well as what he thinks the long-lasting impact or effect of your work will have on the generations to come. Today being a day where radio seems to be going more and more out of fashion, but of course the internet is still growing and growing. It was an interesting conversation, and we went so many places with it, and I know you're going to really enjoy this. I'm going to include many, many, many links within this episode so you can go check out all of Paul Ingles' work, as well as get a little sneak peek into some of the trailers of the films that he's finished. I thank you for listening, and of course, as always, I encourage you to subscribe, like, share this with a friend, and definitely come back for more. For right now, please help me welcome the wonderful, the talented Mr. Paul Ingles. And we're live with Mr. Paul Ingles. How are you doing, sir? Welcome to Our Talk Music. Thank you so much for being here.
It's cool to be here with you, Claudio.
Well, as I've mentioned to you off air, it's certainly such a pleasure and honor to have you here at my house and in my studio, because the series that you put on a long time ago certainly was a catalyst for me pursuing, eventually getting into broadcasting to the capacity that I'm doing it now with this podcast. And it's now, been a couple months since we first talked, and it's been amazing seeing the story of your work now and, everything that you've been up to. And I know we've got so much to talk about and get into in the podcast. But first, tell us a little bit about your background, about where you were born, how you got into, broadcasting and, video work, and what you're doing now.
Well, I was born in 1956, so you guys can do the math yourselves on where that lays me on the timeline. But
63?
Washington, 63 this year. Yeah, you're fast.
Beautiful.
I have a friend who's an accountant who just had a birthday in February, and I wished him happy birthday, and he wrote back to me and said, "Happy 62.5 to you last Thursday." And I said, What are you talking about? And then I look back and your mathematician friends, count on them to deliver you with that kind of useless information.
That's beautiful.
Grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. My dad worked for the C&P Telephone Company, Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone Company. And we were in the Maryland suburbs. So I went to school, public schools in Bethesda, Maryland. And I guess as far as dating my intrigue with radio, this was a real rich time for listening to the radio. This was late 60s, early 70s. I won't get into all of the history of FM radio, but most people will know that FM kind of underground radio was very cool at that time because it was new. People who owned FM radio stations really didn't know what to do with them when the FCC said you can no longer just rebroadcast what was on the AM on FM. Not everybody had an FM radio, believe it or not, back then. So they kind of told engineers and hippie freaks to just, go do what you want to do over on the FM. And what developed was what was initially kind of called underground radio, album rock. Those disc jockeys, they played whatever they wanted to. They played long cuts. They didn't talk a whole lot. There were very few commercials because, again, people didn't have FM radios in their cars. Very few people had them at home. Not many people were listening to them. Thereby, there was not much action going for commercial broadcasters to reach ears. So it was all this sort of open terrain that these early disc jockeys created an art form out of it, frankly. And there was such a great diversity in what they played. They would play everything from pop hits of the day to jazz to rhythm and blues and long blues cuts and black artists, white artists, Hispanic artists. So it was a wonderful thing to listen to. So I'm listening to that in those early days and getting kind of intrigued with it. And then I went to college at Wake Forest University in North Carolina, thinking I was going to be a print journalist or perhaps a photojournalist because I did photography in high school. The second year at Wake Forest, I heard the college radio station. It was actually the night we were packing up at the end of our freshman year. And we had just discovered the FM station at the campus. And, we heard students playing rock and roll shows. And they were good, but my first thought was I could do a show as good as that. So I kind of challenged one of my buddies. I said, when we come back for our sophomore year, let's go up to the radio station and get involved there. You had to take a class, and then you could get on the air. So he didn't. I did. And that was the start of my radio career, basically, because I did everything that they would let me do at the college radio station for 3 years. And then there's a twisted tale we can get into about, the kinds of things that I ended up doing after I graduated. But that was the start of it anyway.
Now, is photography still a thing in your life today? I mean, obviously you're filming quite a lot. You've got videos.
I think I have. Yeah, well, I'm getting into movie making in the last 4 or 5 years, but I think I've always had a pretty good visual sense. I was always the family photographer. And I did take some photography courses at Wake Forest. So it's more of a hobby. But I appreciate great photojournalism. I appreciate great sports photojournalism, which was what I was really into in high school. I started photographing the football games and the basketball games before I started playing basketball in high school. And it was really kind of a little cottage industry because, the students, my classmates who were on the teams, they loved to get photographs of themselves.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, I would take shots. I would take shots, and if I could get their number, in a shot, then I could make $1 for each 8x10. I had a little dark room in the basement and spent hours in there. In fact, they're tied together because I would turn the radio on in the basement doing the dark room work. and then just listen. 4 hours would go by in no time.
Wow.
But, in 4 hours, you're listening to like 50, 60 songs on the radio. So, not only is your knowledge of progressive music expanding, while you're pursuing another artistic hobby. But I love those times in the dark room. So
that's beautiful. I find that a lot of artists have that relationship with another art form, in that some painters that I know love listening to music, and some painters even have synesthesia to the effect that they are affected with the music that they listen to. And so in general, the gentleman that I showed you out there, Ray Espadilla, has that to the extent that all of his pieces are based on a song or off of music that he's listening to.
I think artists connect that way, even subconsciously. I mean, I'm more conscious of it now, how the work of your work as an artist, as a visual artist, as a musician, my work as I'll say radio artist and as a budding filmmaker, it's very much tied to expression of the human experience, and then the battle of the hope of getting the work exposed, but not letting that overcome you so that you get deeply depressed if it doesn't get out there. But have some hope and some perspective on, we could talk about that more later maybe, because I'm sort of fascinated by that struggle internally of creation. And then, I've heard the great artists and the great musicians and the great movie actors, they will finish a project, they will completely lose interest in it, and they want to know what's next creatively. They don't obsess over how many records they sold. They often don't even watch their finished movies.
Right.
And to the extent that they can do that, I'm kind of mystified by that, because there's always this tug for me about, like, when I finish a radio show, for it to be part of my business, I have to market it. I have to hope that stations will pick it up. Same with the movies. I want it to get into festivals so people will see it, give me some feedback. It's very complicated. It's very layered in terms of what's going on in your own heart and your own mind about that. But
sure,
my therapist and I work on that every 2 weeks. So
I might have to get his number from you later.
Yeah, he's great. I highly recommend. We can talk more about that if you want, because
sure,
I think,
because it is a reality of all artists.
Let's talk about it right now. I think just briefly, I think most people's, if you can get on a health plan, most people's health plan allows for behavioral, counseling support, and it's either a real small copay or it's nothing. I'm not paying any copay, to see a therapist. And so now I wouldn't miss it. And I wouldn't, even when I was having to pay a small copay, it was so worth it to be able to have that special place where you're totally listened to. There's no judgment. No matter how many good friends you have, whether you have a trusting partner or not, it's so great to walk into a room for an hour and just to be able to unload, to explore. Oftentimes I have nothing to say, no agenda really or problem to work out. But you end up working stuff out anyway just by talking to a good listener. So go for it.
It's a profound experience having someone truly listen, and that experience I do know. My mother was studied child psychology for her undergraduate, and then studied family studies with concentration in domestic violence. But it was because she became a social worker. But we certainly, I come from a very big family, and we've got psychologists within the family, and it was something I even wanted to pursue in regards to how I loved the interplay of the brain, how it's affected by music. And I never quite got to really jump to that perspective, but having the conversation with a lot of people to the extent of dealing with their psychological situation as it stands from being a creative person and having to have that be your means to an end, and dealing with the ups and downs of it, and not having someone to listen to, and turning to negative things that often get people in way worse situations.
Right.
And we don't ever want to get to that point, but it's also the macho aspect of not wanting to, find help. But in speaking with more and more people about it and realizing that it's just something that all of us could use, like each and every one of us could have that time, that safe space that you're talking about. And not to say safe space with any other connotations, but the idea of actually being able to fully open up and unload for an amount of time where someone's truly listening to you with no judgment.
Right. Well, what you said is just really important that I want to underline is that you said this macho thing that I can do it myself and I don't need any help.
Sure.
I mean, that is, in my view, it's not the courageous way. You know, just like peacemaking is hard, wanting to explore your own life and your own emotions is hard. But it's a courageous thing to do, and there's always a better space on the other side. I mean, it's sort of simplistic, but if you've ever worked a conflict out with somebody, with a partner, with a friend, with an enemy, you know how hard it is to go into that space, to be honest, to hear what they have to say, to negotiate something. It's really hard work, but I'll bet you anybody listening to me saying that who's experienced it know that they got to a better place on the other side. And if they look back and are honest with themselves, they'll probably say, that was hard. I was courageous to do that, and I'm glad I did. So I would invite people to set aside or reframe that idea that being able to handle it yourself without taking quite available support from, I mean, your friends, family, certainly, your closest partners. But if those are difficult people to bring in the circle, you know, to look for that good listener who's a therapist who, you know, knows how to support people without telling them what to do. You don't go to a therapist to have them tell you what to do. You know, you have them to sit there and ask you the right questions so that you can answer them yourselves or work through it. So anyway, yeah, I think that's a good that's a good thing to give a try. It's so helpful. I mean, I wouldn't change a thing about it. And I've been doing therapy on and off, mostly related to trying to get through relationships and stuff for probably 25 years. But I've been seeing the same therapist for 14. I mean, if you want to find out what that experience is like, it is in my latest movie, which we could talk about later.
Let's transition. Let's transition into that. Tell me about that.
Well, I started taking acting classes just sort of as a hobby about 7 or 8 years ago here in town. There was and is a good acting academy called the Soul Acting Academy, SOL. And there are other places where you can take acting classes. But I've just been such a fan of movies and television that I had a sense that I might be able to adopt that craft a little bit. And not to say I was getting tired of radio, but I think I needed something to freshen up for the, you know, middle years, or Act 3, or maybe it's Act 2.5. I don't know which one I'm in right now at almost 63, as you said. But
Yes,
so I started taking acting classes. And so I'm in acting classes with a lot of people your age, you know, folks in their 20s and 30s, and some folks in my age as well. But the younger folks are very ambitious and have large dreams and are very keen on tapping into the developing film opportunities here in New Mexico, of which there are many. So they're very anxious to, you know, get small parts in some of the many productions being done here, maybe getting a background role, an extras role. And I have talked with those folks about what that's like, you know, and they say, well, it's interesting to be on set, of course. You know, you have to stand around for 10 hours. And, you know, I sort of
wait. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, and I sort of say, I don't think that's for me. You know, I don't need to get on that track. And,
Sure.
So long story short, I guess the point is that after I did a few years of acting classes, I thought if I'm ever going to be in a movie, I think I need to make one myself. So I sort of self-financed a short movie, a 35-minute short that I made with friends, you know, acting friends, and my creative partner, Tim Nenninger, who's a cinematographer and an editor, who was just trying to bolster his portfolio as a filmmaker from that end of the business. So we've kind of partnered in exploring that together. And I made this short film called The Weeds in Our Own Backyards, which is now on YouTube. You could see it. You've got to put a few of those words in, because if you just put weeds, well, you're going to get all kinds of things. You're going to get, a study of pharmaceuticals and also how to control weeds in your backyard. But there is that movie, and it was really just sort of a snapshot of mostly autobiographical of a time when I was getting out of a fairly long-term relationship, having to assess a lot of different things, including a piece of the relationship with my father. It takes a little explaining, so I won't get deep into it now, but it was sort of a surreal arc of an afternoon where I had to do some yard work, and it got very difficult, and I couldn't listen to my music, as we were talking about earlier that day, because my iPod battery died. So I had to be with my own thoughts. So it was sort of a personal therapy session in a way, as I was spending hours trying to pull weeds that had grown 6 feet tall in my back alley. And, I thought about all kinds of things related to my life. And so they're kind of pictured in this sequence of what went on that afternoon. And so I finished that. And while that was happening, my father, who lived in a retirement home in North Carolina, as a widow, my mom had died in 2011, so he was kind of soldiering on, and he was a World War II veteran as best he could. But his health took a little bit of a downturn, and I started spending more time with him, flying out there. As a freelance artist, I had more time than my brother and sister, who are both teachers. So I, had times to sit down and talk with him. And, we didn't have a troubled relationship, but I wanted to be able to talk with him about, things that might have been on his mind. And that's as he was moving toward his passing in 2016, I kind of made a commitment that I was going to tell this story in another movie. And so the movie that I produced after his passing is called A Soldier's Passage, which is also the name of a memoir that he wrote about his World War II experiences. And so between we started shooting it in 2017. I wrote it the winter after he died, and took us better part of a year to finish it. And in 2018 we had a preliminary premiere. Won't get into all of it. It's kind of a extended length now, sort of a director's unedited cut where I put in every scene that I shot, and it may have its own value as this sort of 6-chapter miniseries, but I am right now looking at a way to cut it down to a theatrical length. So what was the question? We had gotten into that because
the original question was talking about the films that you're doing now.
Yeah.
You were talking about the film that you're working on right now. But of course, the film that
I remember, as I was saying that, so there's 2 tracks in the film. There's the time that I spent with my dad, and there's the time that I spent with my therapist, trying to work out how to deal with this, important passing in my life, and the impending loss of my second parent, that moment when we're all orphans, when you've lost both parents, there's something that changes then. So I remember now that I'd said, if you want to see what it's like for Paul to be in therapy, then,
there are segments in there, of course.
Yeah, there's probably a quarter of the film is, the time that I spent with the therapist character. And it, as I say at the end of the movie, it was more of an act of transcription than script writing, because most of it is as I remembered it happening with both my dad and the therapist.
It's a beautiful film for anyone that is interested in going to go see that. I'm going to put links so people can check out both of these YouTube videos. And
yeah, there's a trailer that is available, and
that's what's up right now on YouTube.
That's what's up right now. Yeah. I am going through the process because I had hoped to be able to use some commercial music by Bruce Springsteen and Jackson Browne, Ella Fitzgerald, And I'm finding out how difficult and costly that is.
Licensing.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So it's a very slow process. And we will have gone a year probably from finishing the director's cut that has all that music in it that I can only show privately.
So may I ask, are you at the point to where you're reconsidering, like, starting the music over from start one?
Well, I did get clearance from artists who I know well. And then there's probably there's about 6 songs that, I don't have any connection to personally, and like by Sinatra, and, so that I have to pick and choose. I'm working with a woman in Santa Fe named Linda McDill, who has, made a career out of working those licensing issues for filmmakers around here.
Yeah.
And it's just taking a long time, no fault of hers, but it's just like, you can't get through to some of these publishers in any short amount of time.
Sure.
So to answer your question, there's sometimes you can get through to the publisher without getting through to the performer. The publisher may give you a permission to use it with a licensing fee, but you have to have somebody else record it. So that's an option. The other option is to just use incidental music, or to hire somebody else to try to record something. But, some of them are very particular. Like
that's what I was going to ask you.
Well, the song that was playing when my dad actually passed away was Ella Fitzgerald, These Foolish Things Remind Me of You. Because we played, as I was telling you, he's such a great music fan.
Yeah.
And so, we had a music mix on my iPod for him that was playing in the final days when he was unresponsive but could still sense his surroundings, and music just really calmed him and made him happy. So that was playing the whole time, and then 20 minutes, 15 minutes before he actually passed away, These Foolish Things comes up, and the lyrics are eerily reflective on a life lived in the 40s when my dad was a young man, and so it has a big emotional punch for me. So it'd be nice if I could get that.
Yeah.
And then Springsteen has a song called Land of Hope and Dreams that is not of his era, but the whole movie has music from his era and my era because it's our story. Right?
Sure. And that's important music for the story. I totally understand that.
So the Springsteen song has a big dramatic swell that, again, it seems lyrically perfect for that. And as a filmmaker, I'm sure you get attached, and I've only made 2 films, so it's like, there's not tons of experience here, but I'm sure you get attached to that possibility and you say, I've got the perfect song for that. And so I just went with that with impunity, making my what I call my private version that I can share with family and friends. This is how it would be if I had all the money and time in the world.
Yes, sir.
So so that's a challenge, and yes, I will make concessions if I can't afford that or I never hear back from those people.
Licensing, we're drinking out of these cups that say Bubble Bath Records, and my best friend John Maesta started a record label when he moved. He's from Albuquerque and moved there about 7, almost 8 years now, and started this record label, and is working right now with a lawyer and with some people to try and get some licensing deals for the record label. But the whole conversation of licensing is something that in the film industry, in the music industry, in a lot of the industries where it applies, aren't as aware of, and we don't pay it much attention until it's slapping us in the face with a big bill, even venues. Anna Perna's in town, the owner of that. Yashoda's a dear friend of mine, and David, her partner, they, mentioned to me the reality that is, corporations like BMI or ASCAP coming in and demanding money, because music was played there that they didn't get, a licensing fee for.
Yeah, you can't just flip a radio station on and play it in a restaurant.
It's
without
part of
paying the licensing fees that might come from that. And like, I guess they're all sort of rated. You probably aren't paying as much as if you would if you put it in a widely distributed film. And, they do work with you. I mean, there are licensing packages that are geared just for filmmakers who are making films that are only going to show up in festivals, that aren't going to, be in theaters or aren't going to be on TV.
Sure.
And so you like to think, and you try to make that case that, okay, this Ella Fitzgerald song is, we're asking for licensing for 5 years for festivals and, online streaming. And, we're trying to make the case that we're not, out to make a whole, I mean, it's a definitely not for profit.
Right.
Project as much art making is.
Right.
And I have no delusions that either of these projects that I've done have distribution potential. But it takes a long time just to even get that case up in front of somebody so they can say, all right, I understand. This is a nice story. I understand it's going to have a limited audience. Pay us $500, $1,000. You can use it for 5 years. That's the kind of reasonable zone that you hope to find yourself in. Right. But even just getting that hearing and getting that offer is obviously it's a long process, and I'm learning.
So walk me through your transition from college, university, or whatever point in your life led you to Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Well, the short story is that my first jobs in radio were as a news reporter and a sports reporter in North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina. And I was kind of on this is probably heard nationally, but, the big AM station in town. Every city has a big AM legendary station. And so I did that for like 5 years, and I got kind of tired of sportscasting, frankly. Although it was fun, I was doing it in an exciting period in the 80s in North Carolina where there's great ACC basketball. It was Michael Jordan and, Sam Perkins and all these great people that starred in the NBA later were all playing ball in college then. So great action to see. But I got a little bored with it. And because of my interest in music, I was more interested in programming radio stations than in just doing sports and news. So I left that station in order to program a very small station in 1984, 85 that was kind of an oldies station, very wide playlist. And we turned it into a classic rock station, which is very common these days. But back in 1985, there wasn't really a format like that. So I was among the people who was trying that out, and it was pretty successful, but we were on a very small frequency. So the format was successful, but it got picked up by other stations. And I had a point in Charlotte where the station I was working at was going to get sold. And I could either stay working as an assistant program director at the FM station that had picked up our format, or cut bait and come to Albuquerque to be with a woman that I had been dating at that time. And so I just decided, let's go to Albuquerque. So this was 1986 when I came to Albuquerque, and just scrambled to get work in radio here. I worked at a little AM station. People who are from Albuquerque who are listening to this probably know Bobby Box, legendary disc jockey. Yeah. Big, deep voice, real little guy, by the way. But he hired me he was working at a little AM station in Santa Fe at the time, and he hired me to do part-time. And then there was a new station called K-Bear that, if people who lived around here might remember, was a very hip kind of adult rock station. 1987 and 88, it went under as well. I was working at 94 Rock. So I just kind of piecing it together for a couple of years. And then in 1988, I got an offer to take a programming job in Cleveland, Ohio, great rock and roll town. There was a legendary station there called WMMS that the competing station hired me to go up against. And it was very stressful. It was very high wire, a high anxiety place to go to. We did well. I lasted a couple of years. I won't go into the whiny story about having 3 general managers and finally getting replaced there when the ratings wobbled a little bit. I felt like it was a success for me personally and professionally, but you just, in the commercial radio business, it's hard to hang on sometimes when there's so many consultants and quick trigger general managers and stuff. So it turned into a good thing to happen to me, because I went back to school in Cleveland. I got a master's degree in communications, and then Suzanne and I got married there. This was the woman I came out to Albuquerque to be with. And we moved back to Albuquerque in 1992, and we've been there ever since. Suzanne and I stayed together until 2004. I got a job at the university radio station, KUNM. That completed my transition out of commercial broadcasting and into public broadcasting. And I was there for 8 years, and then in 2002, I decided that I wanted to try to do freelance work. And without going into too much detail, I started doing reporting for NPR and for other stations and developing my own documentary projects. Also, 9/11 happened while I was still at KUNM. Suzanne and I developed a program called Peace Talks Radio, which was supposed to be a response to that was a forum for talking about peacemaking and nonviolent conflict resolution in an era that we knew was going to be packed with news about war and conflict. That project continues now into its 17th season and is still a working nonprofit organization. And then Suzanne and I got divorced in 2004, but we still work together on that project. I said it would be a short story, but it wasn't very short.
The beautiful thing about podcasting is that this is all unedited, and this is why I like leaving the conversation like that, because it's about getting to the depths and the nuances you get into.
If people are still listening and not dozing off or flipping it off, but I mean, if you ask a radio guy, what their path is from point A to point Z,
it's quite a long journey.
There's a lot of twists and turns. And
so, walk me through what year Jazz of Enchantment came into the picture.
All right, well, that's kind of is a good place to pick up, because so I left KUNM in 2002 and started creating projects, trying to get grant funding for some documentary work. I did a documentary on Joni Mitchell and Paul Simon with a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. No, might have been the NEA, National Endowment for the Arts. But then I started looking for funding for a local project from the National Endowment for the Humanities and I think the City of Albuquerque Urban Enhancement Trust Fund to create a series that spotlighted jazz musicians who were making their home in Albuquerque. And that was either young musicians who were on the rise or vintage musicians who had landed in Albuquerque or New Mexico, Santa Fe, Taos, as a place to finish their careers.
Yes, sir.
So there was everybody from Eddie Daniels, the great clarinet player who I think still lives in Santa Fe, to... I should have brought my notes because there was the clarinet player that my dad just loved, Kenny DeVerne.
Yes.
Who was a wonderful kind of Dixieland type player that my dad loved that kind of music, and he lived and played in New Mexico for some time. So there were folks in that in that category, and then there were young players who are still, making their mark.
Yeah, like Justin Ray, I remember was one of the guests that you had, who's now getting back on the road, doing a global stadium tour with Michael Bublé.
Yeah.
One of my friends is on the road with him from New Orleans, and so I told him to say hello. But, I met him through, I'd heard about him initially through your program, and then my next director, Brad Dubs, brought him to Manzano High School to do a little clinic, and we got to meet him and stuff. And I'd already known a little bit about him and his story from y'all's show.
Yeah. So and it's fascinating because, you may be the first person. I mean, that was 2005 and 2006 where that came out. And so, for you to give me a call 14 years later or so and say, this project had a big impact on me was, one of those delayed gratification things that, you work really hard on something, you put a lot of quality into it. And it's like we were talking maybe before we went on the air here about, the artist who creates works like you do, visual artists, and, it may not even be in their lifetime that they're really totally appreciated.
Yeah.
And in radio, you kind of put stuff out in the ether and there's really no way to track who's listening.
Right.
I do need to say that a key part of that project was my partnership with Santa Fe photographer and filmmaker Genevieve Russell, who did these remarkable portraits of all of the artists in that series. And if you go to newmexicojazz.org online, you can see all of her great work. You can hear all of the interviews that we did with those 24 artists or so. There's long versions of them, there's shorter versions of them, and there's lots of great pictures that Genevieve made. So, we interviewed those folks. I had some of the folks at KUNM who were better jazz bows than I was.
I was going to ask you, as far as the interviewers, you had four different interviewers in total, including yourself?
Yeah, I did a few of them, but I mostly wanted to hire the jazz hosts at KUNM.
David House,
the late David House, Mark Weber, and the other fellow whose name escapes me right now. But I wish I brought those notes because I hate to forget people's names.
We'll put that name in the liner notes.
Okay,
later.
yeah. So part of my brain will be working on that, which will,
yes, I'm the same way.
Yeah, yeah. But I wanted the people who study jazz and announce jazz to do the interviews more than I did, and then I would do the editing and tighten it up and kind of craft it into a story. And then we put them on the air, and then we put them online, and then we had a few events. We had an event at the Outpost Performance Space.
And the CD you guys released was with just little minutes, of each of the interviews. And it was a 2 CD set.
Okay, so you have one of those.
I mean, that was how
you discovered it. Cool.
Got hip to everything. Because my teacher was also on there, Michael Anthony. I mean, so many people that I was around that then I, got to get closer to, like Paul Gonzalez, like Peter Maul, were people that I later became dear friends with and learned a lot from. John Tronicosta.
Well, the great thing, and I actually ended up doing a piece on NPR about this because they were looking for kind of community stories where music scenes were happening that seemed unlikely. And so I pitched them on saying, there's a pretty hot jazz scene here, and there's no real good explanation for why, but that's what we were trying to document with that series. And I feel really good about it, and that's why I keep paying the hosting fee to keep that website up, because in some ways it's a project that seems like it was a long time ago, but I just think I'm sort of fascinated by any artist's process, and even your story to me is a justification for why keeping that out there is valuable, because it's timeless, really. I mean,
it is. Yeah.
Whether or not these folks are, famous, will be famous, almost all of them, I think, are still great practitioners of their art. But to hear anybody talk about, their creative process at any stage of their life, I think can be valuable to people.
It's inspiring. And for me, I drew a lot of inspiration from hearing all of the different clips and all of the different, segments. And it wasn't until many years later, up until recently, that I discovered that you had made these entire long clips. And tell me a little bit about, I know that was a long time ago, and thinking back to that Outpost Performance Space. Now, when you went about promoting it and letting people know about it, it was through, I'm guessing, the 2 avenues, which was the website and the CD series, right?
Yeah, with the broadcasts, we broadcast them on KUNM, and so every time we put them on the air.
But what would you put on KUNM?
We would put on
the CD?
We would put on the 20-minute versions.
The 20-minute version.
So
within a 3-hour span, or like a 1 hour window.
My memory of it is that once it was done, we worked with the jazz host. There's a 90-minute jazz show on KUNM middays,
yes,
and so. We arranged to have them running, I think it was every day for 3 weeks.
Wow.
For the 20 minutes. So,
that's cool.
So
yes.
all that jazz started with one of these things.
Wow.
And then, of course, you refer people to the website with each one of those. It's a very limited, delivery space because we didn't create CDs to sell, to mass produce. There again, for the artists who were commercial artists, we wouldn't have the rights even with their permission necessarily,
Sure.
be able to make a CD that even had clips of that music and be able to sell it.
And I understand that, and I often wonder about
We
that.
did put it in libraries and got it out to schools. I don't know
The
how
CDs you did.
Yes. I don't know how you got yours, to be honest with you.
It was at Manzano High School.
Okay, so
the director at that time was either Richard Hilkema or it was Matt Talmadge.
Right.
And then
so my memory of that then is that we did make arrangements to try to get them to the music departments. The grant paid for enough CDs to be able to get, maybe delivering 15 or 20 to each music department of all the Albuquerque public schools.
Yeah, that CD certainly made an impact on me. I think I took the CD from the school.
Yeah. Well, put it to good use, it seems like.
I certainly did. I treasure it a lot. And like I said at the beginning of this podcast, it inspired me to really pursue this because I'd loved listening to podcasts before then. I mean, there's a show that I listen to called The Jazz Session. Uh-huh. It's a wonderful jazz podcast that's been around now for 12 years. Mm-hmm. And to think about loving and wanting to do my own podcast and eventually doing one with some friends of mine, but we did about 1 or 2 episodes and then didn't do anything, to finally doing this now. It's what you said earlier. That word timeless is undeniable as to what it is to have a conversation with someone. And I think about someone like Paul Gonzalez, who was on your series, and the state that he's in right now. And
he's battling illness.
He's battling cancer right now. Very serious, treatment to battle and fight his fight. And to know that all of these people are treasures in our music community and in our experiences as growing up in the city of Albuquerque as musicians, for many reasons, I want to capture conversations. I want to listen more about the stories, almost have a continuation of what you'd had with the Jazz of Enchantment series, because they're timeless conversations that will outlive a lot of these musicians that we're talking about in many, many years. And it's a hard thing to think about, but also the reality of what we're reminded of every year as we lose so many greats of the music world.
Yeah, and even when we did it at the time, it was very challenging to know where to stop. Mm-hmm. And even on the NewMexicoJazz.org website, there is a page that lists all the people who we considered, for...
Sure, of course. You have the mentions as well, which was interesting to go through and see.
And periodically people would call us and say, when are you going to add to it? Or when are you going to start it up again?
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, well, it could have had legs. A
long time ago, right.
Well, no, it could have been...
today, you think?
It could have been an ongoing endeavor. But it's hard to find funding, and it's hard to continue to apply for those grants. It's hard to get foundations committed.
That's undeniable. But I hate to interrupt you, but I also wanted to suggest the idea, because those conversations that you have, and I know you'd be paying for hosting in either capacity as being on your website, or if you were to. Not to say that you'd have to go down the whole of re-interviewing and adding new series to the whole production, but even putting out the whole Jazz of Enchantment through a podcast series where people could attain each one of those hour-long or 45-minute-long conversations with each of these different artists and listen to it at a click of their phone.
Well, essentially, it's there. If they go to NewMexicoJazz.org, you go to any artist, you click on their photo, you click on the listen to
conversation, and it's there.
Yeah, it's there. So it was a podcast before there were podcasts,
right? To
some degree, but I don't disagree with you, and I think that probably if I was a bigger jazz fan myself, then I probably would have been motivated to continue it. And I think when we had our first conversation, or maybe I was talking to Allison Davis, who maybe connected me with you, frankly, but she said, I think she was interested, what would it take to pick up that project? And when I laid it out, I think maybe it was a little intimidating to think about how hard the work would be,
of course,
to do it. So I think you really need somebody who's super motivated, mm-hmm. and then is able to get just even a little bit of financial support that, pay somebody even honorarium pay to try to continue to keep it going.
Yeah. I mean, there is Patreon nowadays, which
What's
is
that?
There's a website called Patreon, which is, it's something that a lot of people use through social media, but also just a way that a lot of artists fund their creative endeavors. Obviously there's things that also artists use like GoFundMe, and I'm not as crazy about those things, but to some extent I understand why some artists use Patreon, because it's their way of having the people that support and love the series just make a deposit and donation.
They're trying to connect with people who, traditionally, the fine arts have all been often supported by people called patrons,
yes,
right?
Of course.
So it's good.
It's a good play on the title and what the concept is.
What they're looking for. All right, so I just have to fill this in. You can tell I've been distracted the last 5 minutes or so. But Roy Durfee was the other interviewer, and he was a longtime host and a really smart guy, and did some great interviews for that series. So I can sleep tonight now. I went through that effort to find that. But there are no shortage of great ideas for series.
I also understand as an artist, it's about time.
Oh yeah, it's about time. And when I get to my age, I'm really sensitive about just trying, because I know that there's not going to be a big payback for any of these things.
Course,
so you've got to pick the ones that really totally satisfy you.
Of course, yeah.
And so, making films about things that are important to me is right up there.
It's a lot more gratifying, it seems like, to your soul or your journey through life. Even A Soldier's Passage seems, like you said, and even as the trailer shows, it's certainly, I'm sure even making the movie itself was therapeutic.
Yeah, people ask me about that a lot. I guess it was, in a way. It was important to tell parts of my father's story that, in some ways, it's not extraordinary in a dramatic way. In fact, some people, as I was writing the script, I started going to a script class, and we would workshop pages of the script, and they would say, well, what if you did this or that, or there wasn't enough conflict between you and your siblings. What about if this happened, or your brother said this? And I said, it didn't happen that way. And they said, well, you don't want to let the truth get in the way of a good story. And I kind of cringed at that, because it's the kind of things that, when you watch films, you watch supposed biopics, like my partner Susan and I just watched Bohemian Rhapsody about Queen. Yeah. And, I'm a music historian myself. And so, the first thing we did was, after we finished any of those biopic films, is we go to the web and see, what was true and what wasn't true. And there was enough of it that wasn't true that made us say, well, why did they feel like they had to change that or create this conflict, or in that case, change the sequence of events, or make it look like Queen had broken up when they hadn't, and all that stuff. So I'm kind of losing my train of thought a little bit. But
I agree with you in what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because the reality of hearing a story and then realizing that they got something wrong in the story, it's like, why would you do that? There's so many people that know the reality of the situation. Like Foxcatcher is a movie about a wrestler that, him and his brother were famous, Olympian wrestlers, and they had someone who had a lot of money who, basically paid them to have their living and to continue being wrestlers. And Hollywood turns the whole story and makes him eventually turn homosexual, as well as his brother goes and fights in the UFC, and it's actually in the history books as to something that actually happened in the UFC, and he fought this one particular fighter, and they had him fighting a totally different character in all effects of anyone seeing what this fight was as a fan of the UFC. They said, why would they have this wrestler fighting someone who he wasn't fighting? Even depicting it that way, it's those little details that make people cringe.
Yeah, and I appreciate to make it into a palatable length, 90 minutes, less than 2 hours. A lot of times the excuse for trying to change the story is that you've got to get from point D to point F faster. So you have to do that. And you know, I haven't tried to do that yet. Like I said, I've got a 3-hour movie on my hands right now.
You haven't condensed it.
I haven't condensed it. And as I try to condense it, I don't think I'm going to make any compromises about what actually happened. But,
sure,
you know, you've got to figure out ways to do it. And I suppose that's one of the excuses for changing the story a little bit here and there. And, you know, I mean, in my film, you know, my father has a falling incident, and it didn't happen at the time that I placed it in the movie, but it did happen. And so, I mean, that's a small example of
something you adjusted, right?
You adjusted, but you know, it feels true to the arc of the whole story.
Sure.
So,
sure.
So anyway, it's a challenge to do that. And I guess I got off on that saying that, in some ways the story in the movie is not that extraordinary, but I'm really interested in movies that find profundity in the ordinary. And what was ordinary to some degree was me just being able to spend time with my dad at a time where he kind of needed to unload some things. And I think it's instructive. And the people who like the film have said that mostly people my age in their 50s or 60s are, you know, when sometimes I'd sit down with somebody I haven't seen in a while and, you know, we're kind of catching up. They haven't heard about my movie, but they volunteer that, you know, my father is, you know, in a nursing home for the first time. My father's dealing with Alzheimer's. My mom is, you know, taking a fall and we're taking care of her. And then, you know, I say, well, you know, you might find some value in my movie because, you know, we had similar things happen. And you know, this might have something helpful for you, just in terms of recognizing that maybe what you intuit is that obviously other people are going through that. But when you get a little bit of detail about how to have those difficult conversations, how to convince a parent that they need 24/7 health care, convincing a parent that they need to stop driving, convincing folks that, you know, they need to accept the fact that they can still have a rich life even if they're bedbound, you know, which was my father's dilemma in the final. You know, he woke up saying, I don't know what to do all day. You know, I've always known what to do with my life. He was a real, you know, make a list and get it done kind of guy.
Go getter, right?
Yeah. So what, you know, his legs failed him in the last couple months and people are having to help him. He hated being dependent on other people for help. All those are emotional issues that if a family doesn't talk about them or doesn't leave a channel open, sort of back to the value of talking and therapy, I guess, but it can leave somebody in a very conflicted space in a time where they really should be trying to find some peace so that they can, you know, move on quietly and peacefully. So, you know, I guess, again, everything seems to take a long time to tell, but it's, I think that's the value and what motivated me to want to do that, is to share that. And the experience of being with my father when he took his last breath is like nothing else. If it hasn't happened to you, my character in the film says, I kind of recommend it, you know, even though people tend to try to avoid it. To find a way to be there if you can. Don't count on being there because you can't assure that you will be. I couldn't be there for my mom when she passed away. But it really, I mean, when you see somebody take their last breath, it's unforgettable, and you'll think about it every day, not in a morbid way, but in a way that really enriches your own every breath. You know, I mean, we're all limited. We don't know how many breaths we have, but everyone's precious. Everyone can be enjoyed and relished more. Every moment that you have a human contact or a moment to yourself can be more richly experienced, I think, once you realize and you see somebody take that last one and there's nothing else after that for them. But whatever's next, which, you know, we don't really know what it is. But it could be amazing. And that's one interesting exchange that I wrote about in the film with my therapist is that, you know, my character is sort of dreading, wondering, you know, what it's going to be like to die. And he says, people have gotten close to dying or have had those, moments where they're legally dead for a few minutes and come back, they almost uniformly express a lightness and a freedom. And, he ends up saying, we are all trying to avoid it, but it might be the most powerful, fabulous experience that any soul gets, We don't really know. So those little philosophical gems are kind of peppered throughout the film, and those are the kind of things that I wanted to share.
It's a beautiful thing to have many projects as a creative person that will outlive you. And if you had to think about some words that you would hope that your work represents to people once you're gone, what do you think those would be, and what kind of sentiments would you hope that it brings to people?
Yeah, in the era of the internet, I think that's a powerful motivator. Whether you're an artist of any kind, musician, visual artist, the internet allows a platform, and I would recommend that every artist sort of figure out and put in their will, how to extend.
I was just going to ask you about that.
Hosting arrangements and all that. So, every one of 170 shows I've done for the series Peace Talks Radio is online. It's in a podcast. It's on a lot of different platforms. Our website is peacetalksradio.com, by the way, and it's like an online curriculum for peace studies, peacetalksradio.com. So I feel good that is going to be out there. I don't know how long that project's going to go. We're kind of shooting for at least 20 years. We're at 17 now. So it's a big motivator. And my music documentaries are out there, paulingles.com. I've done 70 hours of documentaries on artists that were important to me, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Joni Mitchells and Bob Dylan's and Bonnie Raitt's. So to answer your question, particularly related to things like peacemaking and the music that I really learned to love on a deep level, I want to be the one that is putting the most articulate and heartfelt framing of those artists' music on the internet and available for public radio. It started when George Harrison of the Beatles was dying, and I told myself, I don't want to wait and hear somebody else's radio tribute to him that falls short in my eyes of really capturing how powerful he was with his music. So before he died, I did a appreciation program of him, and he died within 6 weeks of me finishing it.
Wow.
And I feel really good that it's out there. As we're recording this, it's his birthday today.
Wow.
George Harrison's birthday on February 25th. So I put that link up on my Facebook page every year, and a few more people get to hear it. So that's a big motivator for me to just keep doing it. And I'm not really doing it for the money anymore. There is a little money that can come in from getting stations to license it and agree to broadcast it, but it's not a lot. But the motivation is to just have it out there and know that it's there, hopefully in perpetuity, so that, when people are looking for historical items on Bonnie Raitt and Joni Mitchell in 10 or 15 years, that they will be able to spend those hour or two knowing that they're getting something from somebody who really thought about it. And it's not, those shows aren't monologues from me. In fact, my process for doing those shows is to get fans, music writers, other artists to talk about them. And so they're telling the stories that they know and how they felt about it. I will provide some connective tissue and narration in it. And then I'm also very dedicated to playing the whole song, because I don't like to.
Yeah.
It would be like, you've got paintings from your dad and from your friends here. It'd be like
showing a little bit of it.
Yeah, it's just like take this little 4-inch corner here and say, this is a little sample of it. So, so that's why they're 2 hours long.
And that's a beautiful thing. I have that issue a lot with a podcast because I have so many guests on that are promoting an album or having a single come out. And what I do is in the beginning, I'll just play about a minute or two of it, or maybe 30 seconds of it, and then pick it back up at the end to play the whole thing out. But I'm never about just playing a little snippet of something unless it's music that someone hasn't released and they only want me to play a tiny little snippet of it, you know.
Well, and sometimes you don't have any choice, you know. Yeah. And if the good podcast, well, then we were talking about licensing issues earlier. Sometimes that comes into play. But if a podcast is celebrating the art of conversation, then you may not want to take a break. But I'm sure that with all those artists, you're saying if you want to hear the complete songs, this person's got, their website.
The official link. Yeah. It's
so,
a teaser. Right?
Yeah.
That's, of course, a different tool. Yeah.
There are ways to do it. But, as I was talking about, your first question is about what inspired me early on, and it was listening to those great radio shows. And I was experiencing that music from start to finish, track after track after track by those great radio stations. And so, on the other end of that, if I'm doing a retrospective when Tom Petty dies, I don't, to the extent that I have the flexibility to do that, and it means that I make a 2-hour radio show and then I make a 1-hour version, but I beg the program directors to play the 2-hour version. Because I said, if there's ever a time, when these artists pass away, to let the listeners hear about the song and then hear the whole song, now's the time to do it.
Yes.
Like, if you can't do it the day or the week after they pass away and be comfortable with that, then
there's no other time.
Well, that's just the perfect time to do it.
Right.
So I'm hoping that, those little pieces of radio art are out there and are felt with all the good-heartedness and appreciation that are felt by this end of the process, me doing them, so that it comes out on the other end and people, learn about it and feel something powerful from it, like I did.
Now, in wrapping this conversation up, what is something that you would like a young aspiring filmmaker, aspiring photographer, aspiring person that just wants to express themselves for a living? What kind of insight do you have to give to them?
Well, radio isn't. Most young people don't listen to radio anymore. So sadly, radio is somewhat of a dying art itself. Now, podcasting and other audio platforms allow the tools that worked in radio to be exercised in a creative and even sometimes different way still. So, it's a non-starter for a career. But again, if you kind of believe in the artist way, and if you can find a way to pursue your passions, there are kind of do's and don'ts in radio work and interviewing work that if you want to do it well, then it pays to seek out those resources. So I'll name a few for people who are working in audio. There's a site online called transom.org, transom.org, that is put together largely by radio pro Jay Allison, and it's a great kind of how-to guide about how to do interviews, how to record people, how to create a podcast, how to do a good radio show. There's all kinds of articles from great radio pros in there. They've been at it for probably more than 10 years too, developing that archive of great radio tools. There are some good places. The documentary studies program at Duke University is a place where my friend Genevieve Russell, the photographer, went to, and several other pros who are trying to get started in. They learn how to do audio documentaries and film documentaries there. Probably expensive to do that, but it's available if you want to put your your student loan dollars to that. And then there's another one up in the Northeast. It's a little hard for me to remember, but I can't remember the name of it. I think it's in Maine.
Oh, you're talking about NESCOM, which is now Husson University.
I think it's affiliated with them, but it's got a different name. The program has long had a different name.
NESCOM? Is it New England School of Communication and Journalism?
No,
that wasn't that. Okay.
It's not. Yeah, but if you put in a search for Maine, radio school or something, it'll come up. But anyway, learn some of the technique. Don't just. I mean, it's easy to listen to podcasts and say, "Oh, I can set up a microphone and do that." And there are some really sloppy, awful podcasts out there. Present company accepted, of course. But I think that there's a developing protocol and understanding about what makes a good podcast, and how to do it effectively. Mostly, it would be about how to do good interviewing. Which you have a good natural instinct for yourself, so that helps. But there's lots to learn about for anybody to learn about how to do it better.
Absolutely.
And to keep people's attention so that they might want to listen for an hour to somebody talking.
Yes.
Okay. So, look for that stuff online and think about it and take a thoughtful approach to it. Try to come from the heart. Don't be afraid to infuse your own experience. I do have a video online that I did for KUNM that coaches people. It's kind of like I hesitate to call it a master class, but it sort of takes that format where in, I think, 5 or 6 chapters, I talk with people who are doing music shows on the radio, how to do it more thoughtfully and more helpfully. And one of the points that I bring up in there is that the thing that is you want to look to present the thing that is unique from your experience that makes it different from anything else. Like in music programming, now radio stations are competing against, Spotify and Pandora and Apple Tunes and YouTube that can obviously create an algorithm that will play music constantly.
Right.
Usually jockless, no DJ, no presenter. But I like to make an argument for there still being a place for the human curated playlist where somebody is bringing it to you because they have vetted it and they have had an experience with it. My other project is a weekly music mix that's on a few stations nationwide called 10,000 Good Songs. And it's my record collection, and that's all that it is. So it's limited. I'm not trying to please everybody. I'm trying to please people that have a music appreciation that is somewhere in my ballpark. But, it's 10,000 songs. I promise no repeats. I try to put them together in sets that, are fun to listen to or have some meaning to me, or songs that kind of link together well musically. And so there's an art form going on there. There's an art piece of expression going on there. And my personal stories, a lot of those music documentaries I do start with a story of how I first experienced Linda Ronstadt or how I came to love George Harrison. That's unique to me. That's something that I can bring that nobody else can bring. And if you can tell it in a concise way, in a real way, in what feels like a conversational, heartfelt way, then people will know it's authentic. And they'll automatically, at the beginning of a program like that, say, okay, what I'm going to get is somebody's personal expression of how an artist really affected their lives. And maybe I'll hear other people telling similar stories like that. And so I think we have to continue to personalize our experience with art to help people appreciate how powerful it can be. So that's sort of my biggest nugget is don't think that your personal experience to express in, say, radio with music is invalid or nobody wants to hear that. As long as you don't take forever to do it. If I was coaching you to do it for a radio show, I'd say, tell that story in 45 seconds, 60 seconds. Get to the heart of it. Don't keep going on and on and on about it.
Sure.
So as you're about to introduce a song or come out of a song, makes it, it's what makes it different than a Spotify spin list.
A little bit of flavor, that little bit of intention as to why I'm playing you this song tonight,
It makes a big difference.
Yeah, it does.
I mean,
presentation is everything.
Yeah. I mean, even, the classic disc jockeys from the 50s and 60s, they were so excited about the music, and many of them were really, authentically excited, not excited in a artificial way. And that's how, Elvis, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, were presented to young kids across the country. That's how rock and roll got started, really, And I don't think it would have happened if you just put the music on without a disc jockey, there was all kinds of other things like payola going on, but we won't get into that. But that personal touch makes a big difference in anything you do.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's been an honor having you on the podcast.
I talk too much.
No, you do not at all, my friend. This is why I wanted to have you on. I mean, some of the best conversations that I've had have been conversations where I find myself speaking the least. So I love that. And I appreciate you coming on. Like I said, the series that you did, even though it took that many years to really get the message across to you, but I felt like once I had climbed the hill of finally putting something out, was around the time that I should reach out and really, tell you your appreciation, as well as be able to have the honor of having you on my show and kind of show you the effects of, the result of your product that you put out there.
Well, that means a lot to me, and it means so much to me to see you, trying to, work this craft too. And I'll give you one piece of advice.
Please.
I mean, I think that the long-form conversation has its value. I sure hope people are patient enough to listen to it. I would challenge you sometime down the road, to take the primo nuggets from each of your shows, create kind of a best of super show that, if people don't have the patience to listen for an hour, that they don't miss, the shiny diamonds that you're mining here with all the people that you talk with.
Yes.
And now that would take a lot of work, and I've just given you something that takes a lot of work.
No,
We'll pay you nothing.
As a matter of fact, that idea is something that jumped into my head because of one of my favorite podcasts. My oldest brother was into mixed martial arts, and he still is active with it, but was very serious about it. So I'm into all of that stuff via being around it my whole life. But my favorite podcast is of this gentleman who has a podcast every single Monday, and it's like his church, and he's so enthusiastic about it. He's one of my favorite journalists in the sports, world. I mean, he's specifically for MMA. He's the MMA journalist.
What's his name?
Ariel Helwani.
Okay.
And the show's called Ariel Helwani's MMA Show. And at the end of the year, every year he does a best of show, which is not him talking at all. It's just little snippets of nuggets of different conversations that he's had throughout the year.
Yeah.
And his conversations are a lot more plentiful. Obviously, it's every Monday, and he has about anywhere from 5 to 10 to 12 guests on. And it is a lot, like you said, it's a lot of time. So I at the end of the year, I attempted to try and put something together, but I think I got knocked off around episode 7 or something like that. It's a lot of work.
Well, I'll tell you, it's a lot of work to go back at the end of the year with all of that content and start there.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. It's something you got to plan out.
Well, or, it's like best case scenario is that when I walk out the door, if you remember 2 or 3 things that you liked from what we talked about here, clip those out, put them in a folder.
That's a good idea.
Do it while it's fresh.
Do it every time it's done.
You don't want to look back at that massive
beautiful
audio. So, anyway, I'll look forward to that show, Claudio, when you produce it.
It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to having you on down the road once you put out some more stuff. And I'll certainly be putting a lot of these links that we talked about, as well as some of the the trailer, as well as the series that you got on YouTube.
And
if that's all right with you.
PaulIngles.com has links to all that stuff we've been talking about, and that's PaulIngles. It's not spelled like Laura Ingalls, and it's not starting with an E. There you go. Paulingles.
There you have it, people. Mr. Paul Ingles himself
Spells it out for
Art
you.
Talk Music. I love it. I love it. I always got to spell my name out as well. It's a pleasure, my man. Until the next time, okay?
Okay.
Thank you so much.
To it. Thanks, Claudio.
Yes.
Yeah, that's